Now, Mencius, for many centuries, has been considered the most influential, and still is considered in many senses, the most influential interpreter of the teachings of Confucius. Yet, as I mentioned, he gives a very interesting account in his own right, which is somewhat different from that of Confucius. So, in a sense, he presents a very idealized version of Confucianism. And it starts by arguing that human beings are innately good. Uh, that, in other words, people have a natural disposition towards goodness. And therefore, under this assumption, moral self cultivation really involves developing and bringing forth one's true nature, like sprouts that plants that grow into full bloom. Virtue needs to be tended and cultivated so that it can also sort of open and come into full bloom. Now, Mencius, as I mentioned, thinks that virtue is innate, and most are critically for him based on feelings. Um, we will encounter this later, actually, in the works of David Hume. So, in other words, for uh, uh, Mencius, he doesn't think uh, human minds are just completely blank. That rather we have certain tendencies and abilities, uh, so that virtue is something that doesn't just come from experience, but it comes from certain natural tendencies within us, based on our feelings. For example, he argues that all human beings have minds and that cannot bear to see the suffering of others, and they recoil from the suffering of others. So he argues that virtue is born within us, and the things on which virtue depends doesn't necessarily arise from experience, but rather from innate feelings within us. For instance, he gives an example. If people suddenly see a child about to fall into a well, they will, without exception, experience some feelings of alarm and distress. And the Mencius argues that people will naturally and instinctively sort of react by running and trying to rescue the child or uh, protect the child from falling into the well. Now, this can be sort of countered, in fact, by very contemporary examples that we all seem to have come across, certainly on Facebook, etc., of something very tragic or horrible, something happening to someone or someone's, and people are just standing there and taping it to, then upload somewhere, rather than rushing in to help them. Similarly, there was this classical cases, that still that got studied and still gets studied in sociology and social psychology, etc., of the so-called Genovese case in New York, where an individual, a young woman named Kitty Genovese, who had returning from her work at night, was brutally killed, literally in front of her neighbors. Well, they're not in front of her neighbors; they were in the apartment building, and she was killed in front of her apartment building. They could hear her screams and so on, and no one called the police and so on. So these examples would tend to sort of counter what Mencius is saying, that we are naturally and inherently good when we see something bad happening that invokes sort of very alarming feelings within us, which then leads us to rush in to help. Now, he will argue that not helping, for example, in the case of these people standing and taping, or in the famous Kitty Genovese case, not helping doesn't necessarily refute our good nature. Rather, he would argue that something else is constraining or interfering with our natural inclinations or feelings, not getting involved, maybe because we're scared of being drawn in, or scared of we might get attacked, or something bad could happen to us, or some other uh, aspects that is interfering with our natural instinct. We're too busy thinking about our own other priorities and so on. So in other words, for Mencius, it is our natural reaction to protect and prevent. something harmful happening, not just to ourselves, but to others. It is our natural reaction to help. But in our actions, we don't always do the right thing. And for Mencius, that means that something is interfering with our natural inclinations or with our human nature. And to give examples that certain about human feelings and how virtues are innate within us, he mentions a variety of feelings we innate within us that will give rise to certain uh, actions and motives that are virtuous. He refers to sort of four of these feelings as example. He refers to more. We'll take up four of these feelings here. First, to begin with, this feeling of commiseration. When we see something bad happening to others, we feel pity or empathy. We are able to put ourselves in their shoes. We feel their suffering and danger even within ourselves, or at least feel what that could be like, what they're going through, and therefore we're drawn to help. Similarly, he mentions the feelings of shame and dislike, feeling of modesty, feeling of approval and disapproval. Each of these affect our ethical behavior. For example, the feelings of commiseration that I mentioned, feeling of pity and empathy. These are going to lead us to be virtuous. Because, I mean, and this is sort of relates to what uh, Confucius himself refers to when he's talking about the golden rule. Do not impose on others what you would not have them do to you. Be benevolent towards others, care for others, reciprocity, and so on. All of this, giving rise to this notion of being in someone else's shoes, seeing it from her viewpoint. That this is innate within us, and it will give rise to certain feelings and which will then lead us to act in certain virtuous ways. Similarly, the feeling of shame and dislike is going to lead me towards the concept of righteousness or justice, doing the right thing for the right reason. Because we all feel ashamed when we do something wrong, even if someone doesn't see it. Mencius would argue there's a feeling of shame within us. We may suppress it very quickly by some other self interest or some other justification and so on. But here he would argue that we feel shame when we do the wrong thing, that we dislike doing things that are immoral. And he argues that these basic innate feelings of shame and dislike, if we truly pay attention to them, it's going to push us in the direction of acting for the right reasons. Similarly, the feelings of modesty and complacency. The feeling of modesty is also going to lead us to do the right thing. Why? Because we don't want to be an aberration or an exception. We don't want to stick out. And if we do something inappropriate in front of others, if we do something cruel or immoral and so on, we stick out in public. Others will notice our actions and so on. And our inherent tendencies towards modesty will prevent us from wanting to stand out. Similarly, our inherent feelings towards being complacent will lead us to want to get along with others and not cause trouble and so on. So again, these feelings of modesty, not doing something bad or something wrong that sticks out and everybody notices and perhaps even passes judgment, and the feeling of complacency, wanting to get along with others around us, these will also naturally lead us to behaviors that are virtuous, that are socially accepted, and so on. That would conform with conventional notions of uh, conventional notions of morality, of what's right, what's wrong, and so on. And then finally, the feelings of approval and disapproval. That this is again something that underlies our moral knowledge. Yeah. That, for example, we'd all agree that torture or extermination or genocide of people is a terrible thing. Now, how do we know that these are terrible things? You know, Mencius would say this is because they arouse feelings inside us. We imagine what is happening to the other people, to the people who are getting tortured or getting exterminated or victims of Holocaust or genocide and so on. And we recoil when we think or encounter images or stories about such suffering and brutality. And there's a feeling within us that recognizes there's something horribly wrong in what's happening. Another way of putting it is you can't just simply understand genocide by simply looking at a few numbers or statistics or words on a historical book. It's the feelings and empathies that those statistics and those words may invoke in us. Uh, that gives rise to a whole range of natural emotions that go into this feeling of disapproval and so on. And take the opposite example. When we see someone or someone's doing something unequivocally good, giving charity, helping the one in need, helping the poor, um, helping others in trouble, and so on. How do we know again that this is unequivocally a good act without not someone necessarily announcing it? Again, Mencius would say because it gives rise to an immediate reaction within us that something like this is unequivocally good, and it would lead to a feeling of approval and because we would see that this is something that we would all approve and like doing, that this is the good or the right thing to do. So in all of these, if you notice, is basically starting from a very different place than Confucius, who has no such assumptions of human nature to begin with, and not talking about feelings and so on. As Mencius is, what Mencius is doing, starting from there, he's basically really expanded the Confucian notion of Ren. This all has to do with this humaneness or humanity towards other. And for him, these are emerging through certain feelings. Good feelings we get when we see something good happening, feelings of pity, feelings of empathy when we see something wrongful happening to or hurtful or sufferings of others, feelings of wanting to get along with others, feelings of not wanting to stand out by doing something wrong, feelings of approval and disapproval. In many ways, he's sort of expanding uh, uh, the Confucian notion of Ren, both in the general sense of humanness towards others and in this sort of a particular sense of benevolence and caring for others. Okay, so in this case, then, if Mencius is starting from this idea that human beings are inherently good, what does moral cultivation come down to? You can take a quick look at the couple of quotes we have up there. For example, the man who would be benevolent, in other words, a person of Ren, is like the archer. When the archer misses, the archer adjusts, seeks the cause within himself, makes an adjustment, and fires again. Similarly, if we want to become morally sort of virtuous, and we are sort of not doing it for whatever sorts of reason, something is interfering with that nature, we must make that adjustment within ourselves, seek the cause for that within oneself. He'll have other sort of sayings we'll see. The work of duty lies within. Sorry, let me rephrase that. The path of duty lies in what is near. Men seek for it in what is remote. The work of duty lies in what is easy, but people seek for it in what is difficult. In all of these cases, what he's saying, we don't need to really, complicate this whole idea of ethical behavior towards other. We don't need to go far and wide to seek it. We don't need to do all sorts of different tasks to attain moral virtues. They lie what is near and what is easy. In other words, within us. In other words, human beings inherently, innately know what is right and what is wrong from our from our young age, what to do and what not to do. And if nothing interferes or refutes with our innate human nature, we act virtuously. And yet, we know, as we grow older, is arguing that many things do interfere. You know, other the, questions of welfare, questions of survival, etc. May sort of interfere with the natural inclinations, which is why he says what we have to do is always be clear and focus what lies within us, the source of our virtue. He says, don't lose it. Keep the child's heart. This is sort of the essence of Mencius's thinking. Just to add one last thought. So, in Mencius, therefore, what we are seeing, he's basically saying, moral cultivation or being ethical is really not difficult at all. You just have to go back and recover those feelings, innate feelings that are within ourselves, and cultivate those feelings. And that will naturally tend us towards a good disposition towards others, naturally tend us towards virtuous being and virtuous acts.